And we now have another speaker on the topic of cosmopolitanism. This is my friend Siggy Scott, who is Chief Scientist for Robotics and Autonomous Systems at MITRE Corporation, just outside Washington, D.C., where he's done research on government problems in the public interest for the past 12 years. Since joining the Stoic community around 2015, Siggy has been especially interested in how Stoicism calls for active social engagement and love of all humankind. He's head of the Washington, D.C. Stoa and serves on the Service and Practice Committee of the Stoic Fellowship. Siggy also founded stoicsinaction.org to showcase compassionate, ethically motivated examples of contemporary Stoic life. And his pieces debating and describing Stoic ethics have appeared in Stoicism Today. So, Siggy, thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Greg, and everyone else for hosting the previous sessions. I am really excited to be here today, and I'm enthusiastic that so many of you have chosen to stay on into the afternoon. I know an 8 hour, I don't know if it's exactly 8 hours, but an all-day virtual event is kind of a commitment. I teach 8 hour virtual classes sometimes as part of my profession, and just I don't take your attention and time here for granted. So I'm Siggy. And as Brittany said, I'm a computer scientist, but I have been a practitioner of Stoicism for about 9 years now, plus or minus. Like many of you all, I came to it through, a couple of books here and there that made me realize this is something interesting and attractive. And the rest is kind of history. And so I want to start before I dive into getting to what would I mean by a term like active asceticism, and how does that relate to the many threads that we've already been talking about today of Stoic ethics and cosmopolitanism. I want to say something, I guess, on how I experienced Stoicism in my life 9 years into my journey as one making progress, as we say, right? And I guess one thing is, well, we like our theory, we like our quotes in this community, right? We're based around these old books, and we keep reaching into them. But I guess theory has become less and less important to me, and my experience of Stoicism is coming down more and more to this mental experience, I guess, that we have as we engage in the meditative exercises that this beautiful tradition calls us to. And I promise, I mean, like everybody else, I'm going to have some quotes for you today, but I promise I'm not going to throw up Greek for every single one of them. And but This one is kind of interesting because this passage from Marcus, where he says, "As are your habitual conceptions, so will your mind be also. The soul takes its coloring for the conceptions. Diet then with concepts such as these." I kind of like to point out that the word for dyeing it then, or taking its coloring, is bapte in the command form, or baptitai here. And this is the same root as the word baptize. So, borrowing a Christian analogy here, we are baptizing ourselves, washing ourselves, covering ourselves, immersing ourselves in these concepts, these conversations that we're having today, right? So that we can work them down into our core, into our muscle memory. And that's really how I experience Stoicism, is this endless journey, not just to speak and talk about what we're doing, but to work things into muscle memory so that these principles become mental shortcuts that I don't have to read a whole treatise on. And I feel like that's what we mean when we talk about theory versus practice, is that kind of slow discussion on the one hand that's focused on speaking, as Musonius Rufus says in his lecture on theory versus practice. But that practice is the hard part. It takes, at least it did me, a few years to feel like I was comfortable with the Stoic system and understood basically what this was all about. But the practice is a lifetime and more, right? Um, so what is it that we are trying to die ourselves in? And I think that's why it makes sense to call this a spiritual practice, right? Um, One example that often jumps out to me, it was actually an interaction that happened in a workshop that Greg ran at Stoicon a few years ago in the pre-COVID era on anger. And one of the participants was, whose name I've forgotten, was sharing this anecdote of how in Stoicism plays out in his life, in his relationship with his spouse. He said that when they got in an argument, right, in a debate, and he started getting frustrated and maybe being less gracious and generous than he should be, his wife, who was not a Stoic practitioner, had learned she could just turn to him in a heated moment and say, Seneca, one word, and he would immediately have this like flood of recollection, like Seneca stepped into the room remembering all the texts he's read, all the time that he had spent investing and learning about Stoicism, and that one word was worth 1,000 words, right? Because it allows his brain to activate all these lessons in an instant without having to go through a whole, Platonic dialogue to get there. And to me, that's the power, not just of Stoicism, but of, habit formation and training in all of our lives. But that's really the crux of the journey that we're on here. Um, so I think that's a bit of a fun example, and there are many others I could pull from my own life that maybe aren't the word Seneca, but are similar things. All right, so clearly I have found value as an individual in Stoicism. I found value in the community at events like this, in our local kind of haphazard Stoic fellowship group in my area and so forth. But the problem I want to raise is very similar to how a lot of the other speakers have been laying out their topics today. And that's that for me, Stoicism was not always compelling to me. It made actually a pretty bad first impression. Like many of us here today, I was interested in old books, right? But my first attempts to read Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius left me coming away bewildered and wanting, right? Particularly when I got to where Epictetus says, don't laugh, right? I was like, okay, I'm done. This is no longer interesting to me. I don't need to take a journey closer to a philosophy that starts out telling me, don't laugh. Like, this does not sound like a human way of life. And other things, you all are probably familiar with many of these. We often call them misconceptions, at least when we're feeling confident. But down to do-nothingism is really the big one. And of course, this is one that many people have talked about. We started this morning talking about Martha Nussbaum's, I think, masterful critiques of Stoicism all along these eras. I think of her as the greatest critic and the critic most worth engaging with for the Stoic community, right? Because not everything she says is unfair or is a misconception, right? It's criticism we can and should do something with. Some of you may have read this book by Donna Zuckerberg. That's another one that I think, Zuckerberg was making a good faith effort to examine the modern Stoic community and document how Stoicism has played a role, like love it or hate it, with it, hopefully we hate it, in racism and misogyny on the internet in the 21st century, right? And she comes away asking things like, does Stoicism necessarily perpetuate inequality? When we on this call hear that kind of language, we're like, well, of course it doesn't, right? Let me get a word in edgewise, and I'll tell you the 15 reasons why it doesn't. But she still says scholars are divided on this question. So for me, there's a social problem here beyond my original first impression of Stoicism. There's a wider social problem here in that scholars should not be divided on this question. It should not be ambiguous whether Stoics support perpetuating inequality, right? This is not, if it remains ambiguous over the course of the next century, now that Stoicism is this living, thriving tradition again, then we're doing something wrong, is what I posit. And so at the end of the day, the best rebuttal of the myth of Stoic do-nothingism, we could call it, isn't necessarily the theoretical arguments, the proof texting, the quotes to say, no, look here, Dr. Nussbaum, Dr. Zuckerberg, you're missing out this component and so forth. Though that conversation is important, we should do that. But what really matters, I think, is the proof in our actions, right? And we find today, I think it's resoundingly clear, and today's Stoicon is just one of many, many events and examples that prove this, that lived social Stoicism overwhelmingly refutes the do-nothing myth. And so we can look at the Stoics Care events that Brittany and others have hosted, and so on, right up to politics. We often say that Stoicism is not inherently a political philosophy of the left or of the right. It's an ethical philosophy, so it's compatible with many views on both sides, even if it is completely incompatible with some views like full-blown racism or Nazism, right, is really that's just in direct conflict with Stoicism. People who try to match those two things together are not coherent, I would say. But those extremes aside, whether you today are coming from the left or right of the political spectrum, there is a place to connect Stoicism to your political engagement in the world. And I've got a couple examples on both sides of that here on this slide. So if this was all, then I'd say we were done with this problem of the myth and say, over time, the world will realize this is what Stoicism really is. Listen to the Stoics describe their own tradition rather than misinterpretations of it that cropped up over 1,000 years of having no living community. Right. And we've collected a lot of examples on this. You can find the Stoics in Action reading list a few years ago that collected almost 100 articles on these topics. But I think there still is something in there, back to engaging seriously with our critics like Martha Nussbaum. I still think there is something that we could do better at, and that is when we talk about action, when we talk about engaging with society, often it sounds a little bit like an afterthought. Maybe not today, because we have all these scholars on the call that are really making clear how following nature and things like this integrate with the Stoic worldview. But often we focus on resilience, which is very valuable. Don't for a moment let me give the impression that I'm saying the dichotomy of control and the inner citadel are not valuable and meaningful parts of the philosophy. But we focus on describing that much of the time, and then we just kind of jump to, in some books I've read by prominent modern Stoics, even the jump is kind of a huge discontinuity. Something there's this paragraph that doesn't fit with the rest of the book that says, oh, and by the way, you should be socially engaged and engaged politically and so forth. So that actually is the narrow problem that I want to hopefully provide some contribution today, along with what our other speakers have been saying very valuably in this space. How can we integrate that ethical view into the core of the philosophy and show that it really is all connected and flows together, rather than being an afterthought? Right. And that's very important to me personally, I guess. Really, that's where I'm coming from. It's not necessarily to make other people wrong or to argue with people I think are doing Stoicism wrong. It's just to say the philosophy I want is an ethical and a moral one that calls us to our highest excellence and calls me to the person that I want to be, right? So I need an understanding of Stoicism or hermeneutic that makes that pop for me. All right, so the solution I have to propose to you today, well, it's not a solution, it's just one addition to the conversation. But let me enter into this by saying I'm always searching for the perfect Stoic elevator speech. Let me know if you find it, because clearly I'm here with you all today. I'm passionate about this life philosophy, but when we step outside of our little nerdy bubble, if you don't mind some self-deprecatory humor, where we are engaged with these old books and our PowerPoint slides and our long discussions, and somebody here is like, oh, I heard you're into Stoicism, and they might just ask, what's that? Now I have one sentence to explain to them what Stoicism is without becoming overbearing and giving them more than they asked for, right? And it's hard to condense something as big and complex as Stoic theory down to one sentence, right? So usually I fail miserably and I get wordy or whatever. But here's one that I'm playing with that could actually fit in an elevator ride. Most elevator speeches, quote unquote, can't, right? And so let's try this on. What is Stoicism? What's that? Well, it's a set of meditative practices that is aimed at aligning our emotions with a particularly demanding ethical ideal. So let that sit for a beat. So I haven't introduced the dichotomy of control or anything, haven't used the word virtue or anything else we might want to unpack. But I kind of like this because it puts that notion of meditative practices front and center, which I think conveys how Stoicism is a spiritual practice and a tradition that it makes sense that we would come together at events like Stoicon to discuss how to play it out. But it also ends with that ethical ideal, making sure we're putting a component of that virtue conversation right in our single sentence. Okay, so more realistically, I have trouble sticking to this. I really want to add a few sentences to this, right? It's hard to be satisfied with just one sentence. So let's say you're stuck in the elevator with me and we're waiting on the fire department and I've got a whiteboard. Now I have a captive audience. This is what actually pops into my head when somebody asks me what is Stoicism. Like this is my personal mental map of the philosophy. And if I had a little more time, I would say, well, okay, really, Stoicism is about three basic commitments. It's a claim or a claim about human flourishing and happiness. It's a claim about how our emotions work. And finally, it's a claim about ethical action and its importance, all of which is underlain by this kind of backplane of meditative practices. So this is nice, and I'm sure many of you would love to improve upon or discuss different aspects of making this a diagram of Stoicism, a map overall. I know Chris Fisher is on the line today, or at least was when I checked earlier, and I'm sure Chris is immediately noticing that I didn't put physics on this anywhere, the universal nature we were just talking about. And that's just showing a bit of my own bias, not at all saying that folks who really emphasize the universal nature as in their understanding of Stoicism are doing anything wrong. And if you haven't listened to Chris's Stoicism on Fire podcast, it's a real ride. I strongly encourage it. But this also delineates the problem a little bit. I have no problem finding little boxes to say, well, what's the second order understanding of what is human flourishing? What are our emotions in Stoic theory? But under action, it's not immediately clear what would be the three little boxes that we would choose to say, what is Stoic action? And I think that's because there is a genuine gap, whether you think it's in the ancient literature or in our modern conversation, in terms of fleshing out a shared understanding of what we're really here to do in terms of using indifference as material for virtue, to tie back in with the way we've been talking about it today. So my proposition here today, which I think dovetails very nicely with Professor Rudolph's opening this morning, is that Cicero has the answers, and Socrates has the details. There's this nice little quote I like from Julianas that kind of highlights how Cicero is really our only source that gives a comprehensive introduction to Stoic ethics in a favorable light, right? There's really no other source that gives us that. Everything else is either assumes you already know stuff, or is critical, or is fragments and testimony, all right? So Cicero is really, really important to the survival of the tradition and has been instrumental in how I understand and make sense of how all these pieces fit together. All right, so moving into that now, the kind of philosophical methods that I have to share with you today fall into two categories. Part is theory, and then we'll have a bit on practice. And I brought too many slides today, so forgive me if I go fast. Please try and make up for it in the questions. So we start with the basic Stoic value distinction. I think we probably would have almost universal consensus. It's hard to get 100% on anything, but that if we found what is the real core of Stoic ethics, it's this distinction between virtue and indifference, and more specifically between, we often call them preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. More literal translation would be promoted things and demoted things, things that are led forward or things that are led back. And so the Stoic ethical worldview, however you motivate it, however you justify it, which gets us into conversations about human nature, universal nature, and such, is kind of based on this notion that I think is beautifully expressed by the anecdote of the sun versus the lamp. Versions of it here on the screen are quoted from Cicero and from Seneca. It's a common Stoic motif where virtue is so bright, so beautiful, such an overwhelming view of, yes, that's what I want to aim for in my life when we contemplate it and think about it, that it's like the sun in its radiance. While these lesser things, the indifference, might be like a lamp, right? There's a light to them. There's a certain value to them, but it's just not on the same. It's qualitatively different than virtue. It's not even a quantitative comparison at all. So this is the key kind of cognitive framing that makes all the rest of the Stoic conversation make sense, or that is at least necessary, if not sufficient, to make it make sense. But now we're kind of left with some room for interpretation. All right, we got some nice boxes on a PowerPoint slide. We got some nice Greek terms, but how do we connect this now to things that become increasingly practical? And at least the way that I have listened to the modern Stoic conversation, there's really kind of two main interpretations on offer. One is what Massimo Pigliucci called a few years ago lexicographic ordering of values. I'm a computer scientist, so that lexicographic is a perfectly good word for me, but if that is jarring to your ears, we can say it's the view that there are two kinds of good. One is far more important than the other, but there are two kinds. And in this view, we can kind of rate or order different scenarios by these two goods and say, first of all, you're always going to choose virtue. We never want to choose vice. Easier said than done, but that's the goal. That's the program, and that's where all our intense training and so forth comes in. We're trying to choose virtue. And then second, once you've chosen virtue, now we can start thinking more according to conventional values in terms of what is good and bad and the way we would speak about it colloquially. Or maybe it's up to your preference at this point. We're kind of in a neutral territory where you can maybe go directions that other people wouldn't. But the key is that you're not to make choices that are in conflict with virtue when it comes to the external things that you pursue. So this is one view, and it kind of leans a little towards the Aristotelian end of the continuum, if you will. The other side that we usually talk about, we might call ascetic Stoicism. And this is the view that really puts virtue only at the center, or almost only. And this we might associate with Epictetus, a little more radically with Aristo, who we know from fragments. Here, you're choosing virtue again, but then after that, there's not really much left. The idea is that from then on, you kind of show no preference for things. Or you actively treat preferred indifference with suspicion because they're a slippery slope. And I think this is largely expressed in Epictetus, especially that suspicion part, even if he doesn't reject that second class of value. But also, I think when people like Martha Nussbaum are concerned that Stoicism says these external things don't matter, I think this is the view of Stoicism that they're thinking of, the ascetic end of the continuum, that gets a little closer to cynicism, even if it's careful to distinguish itself from true neutrality about external things. So I offer you today that both of these views have a problem, and that's that they're trying to consider virtue independently of external things, and that just can't be done. Another way of putting it is that somehow, once we've attended to virtue, we've got spare time. And we have a decision to make about what we do with that spare time. Do we pursue indifference, or do we not? Do we just treat them as fully neutral? So this plays out on the ascetic end with Epictetus saying familiar things like, be ready to reply, that's nothing to me, to anything that's outside of my control. I'll ignore those things entirely, or really, Epictetus is training us, so he maybe doesn't mean that literally, we would hasten to add, right? But Cicero says, be really careful with that. Because if you make all external things absolutely equal, then you've abolished virtue. There is no virtue left. You've actually destroyed what you're trying to do. Well, that's interesting. Why would he say that? And he's drawing on canonical Stoic sources. He's not making this up. Coming back to the other side, let's say in our spare time, we're going to choose things that we prefer. Seneca often comes close to this, even though Seneca can be very, rigid in his appeal to training and the distinction between virtue and everything else. But he does, he's famous for saying things like, well, I don't love wealth, but boy, do I prefer it. And wealth affects me and exhilarates me like a favorable wind. So he's kind of eager to make some space for these external things that we like, that maybe gets a step away from considering it only in terms of virtuous decisions. But again, Cicero is going to come in and be like, if you go too far that way, you've got big problems as well. Because if you admit a second good, anything besides anything being on par with virtue, especially, gosh, then you've extinguished the very light of virtue again. So we have to find a balance here. So here's how I propose that we make sense of this. And some of you may already know where I'm going, and some of our conversations today have presaged this. And that's Cicero's archer, which is logically equivalent to the Stoic ball player that we saw this morning, right? And this is the view that those things that are preferred, as Cicero puts it, are a means to the end. They're the material for virtue to act upon, as we take from Epictetus in Discourses 2:5. So this kind of leads to me, and this is why I feel like reading Cicero, even though you can find these ideas in the other texts if you look for them, was so impactful on me, gives a different picture of how we understand the relationship between virtue and indifference, which I call active asceticism. And this is that virtue requires that external action. They're not two separate activities. So yeah, first we want to choose virtue. That's always where we start. But doing that requires promoting certain externals. That's why we call them things to be promoted. They are things that are in line with human nature and that we all recognize are worthy of being pursued, even if we even if we don't control the outcome or choose to locate our highest happiness with a capital H in them. And then we're done. There is no second step. There is no spare time in this view for us to pursue indifference for their own sake or to really make any other decisions, or at least there's very little neutral time because virtue becomes this all encompassing commitment that we want to govern all of our lives. That's the point of having an end in the capital E sense that the ancient Greeks meant it, right? So this is why I say it's a very demanding ethical picture and even an ascetic one, even though in line with the circles that we've been talking about all day, right, it has room for self-care because taking care of yourself is virtuous. Seneca says things like maintaining good hygiene and dressing well are part of the exercise of virtue because they are things that are worthy of being promoted for human beings. So this is, I realize I'm deep in theory now. These are abstract boxes on a PowerPoint slide, right? And these are terms that we have to then apply in our lives in detailed ways. But this has been a very powerful framing for me that makes the whole rest of the Stoic literature make sense in a way that I want to follow, right? All right, so I'm going to blaze through a few points here in the interest of time. But for me, this is what makes Cosmopolitan make sense. Now we're starting to see how it's not an afterthought. It is fundamental because you can't do the Stoic thing, which is to pursue virtue as your end, without doing all of this other stuff, without caring for others in external ways, in ways that pursue things we do not control, in ways that help them experience less pain in the physical sense, not just in the soul, and so forth. So let me leave you with a few nuggets that practice may be a strong word for it, but are at least a little less abstract than these basic framework principles that pull the Stoic way of life together. So these are candidates for what we could use to fill that box when explaining what the discipline of action, if you will, is. Epictetus had his discipline of action, but if he gave lectures on it, either Arian of Nicodemia didn't write them down for us, or they were lost, because we don't know much about what Epictetus meant when he said, practice the discipline of action. So one easy thing to reach for is the circles of Hierocles. We've hit this many times today. It's a beautiful meditation exercise is how I think of it primarily, and also a way of thinking through your roles in life. But I want to take us back to Socrates for a moment. And take three nuggets from him, because Stoicism is one of the Socratic traditions. They viewed themselves as successors and heirs to Socrates, particularly to his dogmas, his doctrines, to the extent that he had them, even though finding Socrates' doctrines in his method is of course, a famous puzzle. And these are the virtues, of course, and Socratic psychology or ignorance, we often talk about, came up in the chat today already, and Socratic dialogue. So virtue, I won't say very much about this, but this is the fundamental problem of virtue ethics that's often discussed of it doesn't tell you exactly where to, invest your charity dollars or take other specific actions the way that utilitarianism at least tries to. And it doesn't give you clear rules for behavior, but it gives you these principles like temperance and courage. I think these are really important for approaching socially complex problems where we need to be acting in the world. Think politics or relationships, handling disagreements with your loved ones. We don't know the right thing to say in any given setting. It's very hard to tease through and to get consensus for crying out loud on what we should be saying about political issues. But checking our own and constantly exercising mindfulness or prosoche around our own motives and whether we're saying things based on desire and selfishness or on fear and discomfort, or if we're really thinking through things fairly, is a really valuable principle and one that we should view as profound, not as an afterthought, because it's hard to put these things into practice. So that's one, application of virtue, right, is where we can start, which we could call a Socratic principle. Um, a much more, I guess, distinctively Stoic one is Socratic psychology. So this is, we talked about it a little bit today, the notion that everyone does what they think is good in some suitable sense of what it means to think that something is good for you, at least in the moment, and to realize that Epictetus says that's how it seems to him. I found that's like shouting Seneca in my life is on social media when, the ire rises, as social media is very good at pressing our buttons, to step back and say, that's how it seemed to them. I found to be a very powerful shortcut or tool in my own life. Right. This notion, which we could have a whole talk on, of Socratic psychology and recognizing that people do wrong in a sense out of ignorance. There's a connection to physics here. This is where determinism, as opposed to libertarian free will, makes a profound influence, I think, on Stoic ethics. I'm a proud compatibilist if you're into the free will debate, which we can set aside for the time being. But this leads us into something even deeper than just being willing to forgive, and that is unconditional love. This is a term that maybe we don't usually associate directly with Stoicism, though many of our leaders in the movement have associated this term with Stoicism. If you look, deep in their books, um, and this is actually an argument that Martha Nussbaum makes. This is an argument that she makes in our favor, if you will, in her book Anger and Forgiveness, which is masterful. I highly recommend it, even though she continues to be critical of Stoicism and stick to interpretations of Stoicism that maybe I'd like to push back against. She also adopts Stoicism virtually wholesale, at least in certain restricted social contexts in this book, and develops a neo-Stoic, a modern Stoic theory of dealing with anger and forgiveness. And she argues that there's kind of a continuum. You have kind of transactional forgiveness on the left hand, which is, yes, you're forgiving somebody, but it's because you're in power and you're like, I bestow upon you the release from the anger that you really deserve. Moving to unconditional forgiveness, all the way to unconditional love being even stronger than unconditional forgiveness. That's where we say no one ever deserves to have pain returned for pain, which is the classical definition of anger. No one ever deserves to suffer vengeance for what they have done. That doesn't mean Stoics don't support criminal justice systems or disciplining our children and things like this, but we find reasons for it that are completely removed from vengeance, which we view as being the kernel of what makes anger, at least with a capital A, anger. So we reject all of that, and what's left is a forward-looking unconditional love, where if we could, we would love to reform everyone and to make everyone our friends. We know that's not always possible, but we'll go as far as we can. So this is a beautiful interpretation of Stoic ethics and the living out of action, at least according to principles of love. And I feel like if Stoics were known for this kind of engagement, a lot of the myths of do-nothingism would resolve themselves, right? Socratic dialogue, I will skip over so we have some time for questions. But it's very similar. Gentle dialogue is what the Stoics were known for in the ancient world. And they had a view of Socrates as not so much the gadfly, but as somebody who's willing to meet people where they are and dialogue with them about the truth in a kind and patient way. So I'm a scientist, so I can't have a talk without a results section or it feels empty. Here's my proposition of those three principles: applying the virtues, Socratic psychology, and Socratic dialogue that maybe are candidates for your second order understanding of what action means in Stoicism. There's many other possibilities, and I would hope that we can open up a conversation about that. And some data for you finally. We've been having this 1,000 Stoics challenge going for several years through the Stoic Fellowship. This occurs every April, which is the fellowship's month of service. We're trying to get up to 1,000 people to register in 1 year or 1 month that they have performed some kind of act of kindness or service for the month of service because of their Stoic practice. Right? We were making good progress last year. We got up to about 400 people registering their acts here. It dropped back down in 2024. So show up for us in April so we can get those numbers up. All right, and Brittany, I think I left us surely at least a couple minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I always make too many slides.
No, thank you, Siggy. I was just thinking you need to write a book about all of this. There is so much information here, and I saw a lot of comments. People were like, "No, no, can I write this down?" So please do something further with these slides. Turn it into a pamphlet or something. And we have exactly 4 minutes left. So thank you to everyone who has entered questions already. I think we will start with, let's go back to the beginning when you proposed the definition, the elevator pitch version of Stoicism as a set of meditative practices. I think there were some questions about what exactly you meant by that. And maybe in the broader context, is it more just like cognition, thinking, reflecting? I think a lot of people might be picturing sitting down and doing like a mindfulness meditation or a Buddhist
Yeah.
meditation. So could you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, and that is kind of what I'm going for with that language. I mean, we all like to sometimes bum a little of the prestige off of the mindfulness movement, right? That has taken the world by storm. Um, if I can steal the screen share back and pop up the diagram. Yeah, so what I have in mind are these specific sets of practices that I think of as canonical and common themes in the Stoic texts. So, yes, thinking rationally, yes, applying yourself prudently, and all these things. But we have these specific things that we talk about and we know about together and we can converse about, like premeditation of adversity or voluntary discomfort, right? Those are very famous. But also the circles of Hierocles that we love and appeal to frequently, even though that was one fragment from a Stoic thinker we don't have full books from. And for me, actually, death meditation is huge. That's why I became a Stoic, is through reading, it was one of Bill Irvine's books. I realized that you don't just meditate on death to cope with your fear of death, though that's been important for me, right? I've had my own brushes with recognizing my own mortality, right? That we all have as we age. But it's what happens right after the meditation that is profound for me. Of I could die at any moment, therefore you only live once, YOLO in the positive virtue sense, right? I want to jump up. It's the jump up and call your mother kind of component of Stoicism while you still can, or jump up and go apply yourself to whatever role you're in that morning, or whether it's at work or in the home. Spend time with your daughter. I have a 1 year old that means a lot to me right now. So all of these together, I think, form a cluster of meditative practices that are one valid way of defining what Stoicism really is.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And this kind of follows into the next question. Just could you leave us with maybe a concrete practice? Sasha says, what would you say to the idea of implementing more practical ways into modern Stoicism? So, like Buddhism and Taoism do a good job with martial arts, the Japanese tea ceremony. Are there any practical, concrete strategies that we can use in our relationships, in our work, anything like that? Maybe just one example drawn from your own life, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I guess Uh, to come back to the nugget I ended on, which was Socratic dialogue, um, um, I'm passionate that the way we treat each other in disagreements, in moments where tensions run high, is one of the most profound ethical spaces for us to act in. In those moments, whether it's an argument on the internet, enough of us have had those about Stoic doctrine, right? For example, or whether it's a more intense, like, political difference or familial issue, being willing to make space for the other person and acknowledge the good in what they are saying before you go to criticizing what you think is wrong is something that's very, very difficult to implement well in all situations, but I think is one of the most profound tools we have to bring about peace on our local lives and ultimately, if we can scale it, which is really hard because humans are these big anthills, um, up to things like international conflict, right?
Absolutely.
Sorry if that's still a little bit of an ideal rather than a practice, but things like getting involved in volunteering with local charities, deciding whether how much to donate locally when you have the resources versus how much to donate to developing countries and non-government organizations there, like we were talking about today. Those are all part of it, but there's 1,000 different things that you could do in terms of being engaged in the world. So it's hard to pick one, right?
Right. Well, we'll look for the details in your future book, which we all look forward to.
You flatter me, Brittany. I'll follow in your footsteps someday, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Siggy, for being here with us. And I will turn it back over to Harold, I believe.